Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Conversations Over Coffee with me, Rabbi Steve Wernick. Today, I am delighted to welcome Ben M. Freeman as my guest, and I look forward to talking to him about Jewish pride. Before we get to that, we're on Facebook, YouTube, and bethtzedek.tv. If you like today's conversation, don't forget to give us a thumbs up and to share it with your friends. Comments are always appreciated and help us get the conversation to more people. If you have any questions for our guest, please put them in Facebook or YouTube chat, and we'll do our best to bring them into the show. With that out of the way, let me introduce our guest. Ben M. Freeman is a Jewish leader, Jewish thinker, and a Jewish educator. Born in Scotland, Ben is a gay Jewish, internationally renowned author, educator, and diversity, equity, and inclusion specialist focusing on Jewish identity, combating Jewish hatred, and raising awareness of the Holocaust. He came to prominence during the Corbyn Labour Jew-hate crisis and quickly became one of his generation's leading voices against anti-Jewish racism. Please welcome Ben to the show.
Hi, Reb Steve.
Hi, Ben. You know, I only read part of your bio because there's really a lot there.
It's long.
What are some of the other things that you think are important for people to know about you?
So I think one of the most important things about my work is that I am a trained teacher. So I've just relocated to London, where I am right now, but previously I was living in Hong Kong and I was teaching full time. And I think that centering the voices of educators in these conversations is so vitally important, not only from a research perspective, but also just the idea that, I had to stand up in front of classes of young people every day and explain very complex topics. And I think that is a difference I see kind of maybe between my work and maybe kind of my more academic colleagues, who it's much more centered in the research and academia, whereas my work is really centered in kind of creating accessible content for people and creating accessible lessons for people. So I think that really is something that's important because that drives all of my work, including the writing.
So the Corbyn, I don't even know what to call it, but when Corbyn was leader of a major political party in England, that's what kind of motivated you and inspired you to become an advocate. Tell us about that moment and the areas of, or point to the things that really got you going.
So I had been working for many years, over a decade, kind of at grassroots level, wasn't on social media really. And the Corbyn Jew-hate crisis, the Labour crisis, was something that shocked the British Jewish community because we had, not necessarily maybe as much as the Americans, but we had kind of the idea that, okay, we're fine. We know that there's Jew hate, but it's not in the center of our society. It definitely is there, but it's in the fringes. And this kind of led us to understand that this is in the center. It's in the center of British political and social life. And that was really terrifying. And also the gaslighting that went on, the major news publications kept referring to it as a row. That might not make sense in my accent. So in an American accent or a Canadian accent, it might be a row, like a quarrel. This wasn't a quarrel. We were a tiny ethno-religious community being kind of actively targeted by Her Majesty's official opposition. That is the official title of the shadow or the leader in the opposition party. And it was just absolutely astonishing to see how overt it was. Many of us are used to the dog whistles. Many of us, again, understand that this exists in the fringes, but this is not where these conversations were taking place. It was happening right in the center. And it made many British Jews feel unsafe, feel unwelcome. Some British Jews left, a small number, but there was a poll done and 50% of British Jews said they would leave if he became prime minister. That's about 125,000 people. That's a lot of Jewish people. It's a lot of British citizens. And the idea that we were maybe not as accepted as we thought we were, I think was very shocking to many people. So, that's, I guess another thing to say is that this was from the left. A lot of people are understanding of Jew hatred when it comes from the right. They're much more familiar with it. But this was very much leftist in nature. And of course, as we mentioned in our kind of pre-conversation, it's the horseshoe, right? So it's not that far away from the far right. But you had people who were kind of describing themselves as anti-racists, as pro-LGBTQ+, pro-women, pro-different minority groups, actively targeting Jews. And Corbyn is no longer leader. He left in about March 2019. And some people think that because he left, the crisis is over. It's not. You know, the genie is out of the bottle, and 10 million people voted for the Labour Party in the election in 2019 where Corbyn lost. And that's a significant part of the electorate, a significant minority.
To what extent do you think he lost the leadership, though, because of his Jew hatred? You know, because certainly when you read the news from this side of the pond, it seemed like that played a role in it. And I'm just curious, you know, obviously from your perspective, from being citizen of England, Great Britain, and of you know, now being there back in London. To what extent do you think this was a Corbyn thing versus a Labour Party problem?
So I think first, the first part of your question, it did play a part. There is evidence that it played a part. I don't know how large a part. I don't think that we can say with any certainty that he lost because of his kind of stance on Jews, but certainly people were questioning him. But also, you know, he didn't have a stance on Brexit. He was kind of a bit of a disaster in many areas. So I think people were very turned off. What began as a Corbyn problem became a Labour problem. What began as a hard left problem became a left problem. What began as a political problem became a societal problem. And I think that is the way really I look at it. You know, the leadership of the Labour Party is different. Sir Keir Starmer is now the leader. But I don't necessarily think that he is, you know, he really truly understands Jew hatred, and that's part of the problem. A lot of people just don't understand it. So I think it is still a Labour Party problem, but more than that, it's a societal problem. It really is deeply embedded. I had dinner with a very close friend, and they were asking me the exact same question: do we think that it's solved? And it's like, I don't think it's possible to solve it in this short amount of time. It's only been a couple of years since he left that position, and it really exploded. And people came into the Labour Party specifically because he was the leader. People who shared his views, and I kind of, you know, experienced his supporters, Labour Party supporters, still harassing people like me and other British Jews online. So while effort has been made, I don't think enough effort has been made, and it certainly is still an issue. And it's certainly why I would never vote Labour. I think it would take a lot, or rather I would say it would take a lot for me to vote Labour. No.
So you are one of the up-and-coming Jewish leaders that speak specifically of Jew hatred and want to change the conversation from anti-Semitism to Jew hatred.
Yeah.
What's going on with that? I mean, like anti-Semitism, Jew hatred's been around for thousands of years, right? We can go back to Pharaoh, to Haman in our own sources and see it. It's been around for thousands of years. Why the shift from anti-Semitism to Jew hatred?
For me, it's about pride. The word anti-Semitism was created by racists. It was created to cast Jews as biologically different, as part of kind of pseudoscience and race theory. And the word was created in 1879 by Wilhelm Marr. And it was really rooted in the sense that Jews are biologically different. And even if we speak German, we don't belong, because we speak a Semitic language, i.e. Hebrew, we're therefore Semitic. And there are no Semitic people, they're just Semitic languages. So it's about pride. I don't think it's appropriate for our community to use a word to describe our experience that was created by people who actively tried to harm us. And, you know, there's many words. There's anti-Jewish racism, there's Jew hatred. I know that some people really push Jew hatred. I kind of like move between them. And it's about Jewish people taking control of our own narrative. One of the reasons I use anti-Jewish racism is because Jew hatred is a form of racism, and it's very important that people acknowledge that. And that's something we saw during the Labour Party crisis that we just discussed, that people don't see it. People don't think that we experience racism, and we do in the ways that all communities that experience it do. So for me, it's about pride and it's about accuracy, and not depending on those who hate us to describe our experience.
The whole racism conversation for the Jewish community seems to have become more complicated in our day and age. Has to do with on the right, we're seen as other,
For sure.
and on the left, we're seen as privileged.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, so it's like we can't win.
No.
We're perhaps the only hatred, the only racism that unites the right and the left in their sense of not liking the Jews.
Yeah,
How do you understand that?
I think too many people try to understand Jew hatred via its source. So they look to the left, they look to the right, they look to the Islamic world or other minority groups. But I think, in the way I teach it, the way I write about it, is you have to understand the content. And actually, the content is kind of the same regardless of who's saying it. It's just, as you say, slightly tweaked. So the right say that we're not white foreigners, particularly in, say, Britain or America. The left say that we're white and we're oppressing black and brown people. So it's really the same thing. It's imposing an identity onto us. It's assigning power to us that we don't have. So for me, the most important thing is when we're really educating is the content. And of course, once we understand that, we can get into the nuances of the left and the right and whatever else. But the basic conversation should not be via its source, it should be via its content. And I think too many people get wrapped up in that. And I think also, particularly in the United States, and this is not our experience, but it's so partisan that it's difficult to talk about. If you're in the right, it's difficult to talk about right Jew hatred. If you're in the left, it's difficult to talk about left Jew hatred. And that is across the board, I think. But it's the most important thing is that we understand what are they saying about us? And they're all saying the same thing, that we're dangerous, we're powerful, we're a threat, we're oppressors. And you kind of have a little nuance change here and there, and it can fit many different ideologies, as you say, where it's like we bring everyone together.
Your response to this from the critically acclaimed book and work that you're doing is about Jewish pride. How does pride respond to the content of Jew hatred?
Well, it tells Jews to reject it. It says that is not our experience. That is what they're saying about us, them being the wider world. So they don't get to define our experience. They don't get to shame us. We get to define our own experience. We get to discuss the beauty of what it means to be a Jew. We're not defining ourselves via their ideas, their narrative. And I think that is why Jewish pride is an antidote. It's not going to stop the non-Jewish world from saying the things they say, doing the things they do, but it builds a barricade within each Jew and within our community to say, no, we reject this. We reject these ideas. And that really is rooted in self-esteem. So it's about, making sure that Jews have sufficient self-esteem and sufficient pride to say, you're not going to shame us. I'm not going to accept the shame that you're trying to impose on us, because there is a difference between being shamed and being ashamed. They'll continue to try and shame us, but we're not going to be ashamed. And similarly, we're not going to utilize their definitions of Jewish identity, because to be quite frank, their definitions are A, inaccurate, and B, rooted in hate. So we need to come together to discuss what it means to be a Jew, and basing those conversations on our history, our experience, our text, not necessarily or not at all utilizing non-Jewish ideas. So that is, it's in a way an antidote, but I guess it's an antidote to the impact of Jew hate on Jews, not necessarily an antidote to Jew hate itself.
Right, and even there though, it's like I don't know the data all that well in Canada or around the world, but I know in the United States, something like 90% of Jews report being have pride in their Judaism. But what I found really important in the list of things that you talked about that went into that pride, is that having pride without having Jewish content is that pride is it's lacking. Right? It's about our wisdom, our text, our history, and so forth. How do you get that to people that might feel proud about Judaism but not interested in understanding where that pride comes from?
I think it's about educating, and it's about educating without shame or judgment. Not necessarily being like, oh, you don't know this. Okay, well, that's the shame on you. No, it's about saying we've all had different access to this information. So let's discuss it. Let's create as a community communal organizations that are designed to educate. And I don't just mean that education about the biblical stories, teaching people where they really came from. The number of Jews who say, we're Eastern European, we're this, we're that. It's like, no, you're not. And I don't say that to kind of erase their idea of who they are, but we can track things historically, and historically we need to understand who we are. We need to utilize not just we don't just need to build a Jewish Pride movement. We need to utilize it as a framework to look through our experiences. But yeah, it's education. It's education and then action. So every Jewish person has to, I believe, be actively Jewish every day. And that's going to look totally different. I describe Jewishness as kind of a great big buffet table, and each of us will go and we'll choose something different from the table, and that combination, those different combinations are our strength. But we need to be recognizing and honoring our civilization, which is what we are, I believe, every single day. And alongside that, of course, comes education. Who are we? Where did we come from? Why do we speak the languages we speak? Why do we do what we do? What was our experience, say, living in Eastern Europe? And why did that specifically mean that we were not Eastern European, we were not Russian or Polish? So it's about understanding our experience through our own lens and educating about it.
Can you give me a specific example of what you mean? I mean, because, you know, the Jewish community talks about education all the time in a variety of different ways. I'm hearing that there's a nuanced difference in the way in which you're using it. So I think it'd be helpful if we could go down a little bit more.
No problem. I mean, I would say that the Jewish community has failed. We have failed communally to educate, and it's no one's fault, and it's based on our specific context. But what I mean is creating courses for people. So a very practical thing would be creating courses, making them accessible either via shul, via an online platform, via an organization, and taking people through our history. Okay, so let's have a history about let's have a course about Jewish indigeneity. Let's have a course about the Shoah. Let's have a course about Jewish resistance. Let's have a course about the Ashkenazi experience, Bet Yisrael, Sephardic, Mizrahi. Proper education. You know, maybe this is shooting myself in the foot because I do a lot of talks. Not just talks though, proper courses, 8 weeks long, 10 weeks long that people sign up to. That I believe is it's such a rich, incredible civilization. We can't possibly teach about it in just one little hour-long talk or half-hour talk. And we need to be, as a community, devoting resources to that and prioritizing the voices of educators, as I said at the beginning, and making sure that it is accessible to people. So again, not excluding kind of our Jewish communal structures and the organizations and the shuls, but making sure that people who maybe aren't affiliated can also access. That's why online is such an amazing platform. I mean, I'm living in London and you're in Toronto and we're having this conversation. So it's more than possible. The community just has to kind of get there with the aim of being like, okay, we're going to educate people about the first 2,000 years of Jewish history. What does it mean that we're Indigenous? Let's teach it. Let's explore it for adults and for youth.
But people don't seem to be interested in making that kind of time commitment for something that's so heavily cerebral.
I'm not entirely sure that's the case. I mean, maybe from your experience, from my experience, I can see that whenever I talk about the courses that I was teaching in school online, countless people would message me and say, when can you run this? Courses. I ran webinars previously, 2-hour-long webinars, and people were asking for courses. So yes, it may not be for everyone, absolutely, but it's the very basic, right? If I'm teaching a class at school or at university and I'm wanting my students to understand, okay, German Jews in the 19th century, it's not just a one-off lecture, it's a course. And we need to kind of use that approach with regards to our own history. And it doesn't need to be, purely academic. Great educators can make content accessible. You have activities, you have research, you have, many different tools to help people learn. But I think I'm not entirely sure that we've tried it. In my lifetime, I cannot see that it's ever been tried like that.
Are you familiar with edX?
No.
So edX was started by MIT, Rochester University, and I think maybe Harvard or Stanford, one of the two. About 6 universities started it, and it's a platform by which now universities across the world can offer courses in a variety of topics. Those courses are anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks long. You can do them asynchronistically, or you can do them synchronistically. But what it sounds like you're suggesting is almost an edX for Jewish experience and Jewish life.
Absolutely, and making it accessible both financially as well as kind of in terms of different learning styles, 100%. And people are crying out for it. You know, I've been fortunate enough to speak to hundreds of communities across the Jewish world, and in a lot of them, people have asked me, why didn't we know this? Why didn't we know the contents of your book? Why didn't we know the basic history? Why didn't we know that we're Indigenous? And I'm really not blaming anyone. We all respond to the context in which we're in, and everyone makes the best decisions that they know how to make in that specific context. But I think that what we're seeing, partly because of social media, is that we have not done enough to educate. And I think that is the most important thing in our community.
So Jewish pride, Jewish education as an antidote to Jews not feeling ashamed or defining themselves by the way in which others would define them.
Absolutely, and not seeking acceptance. Of course we want to integrate. As a British Jew, I also want to be part of British society, but I want to do so. I want to integrate with an understanding of who I am. I want to integrate understanding the rules of engagement, understanding the history of Jew-hate, understanding the kind of tensions that exist between the Jewish community and the wider British community. And I want to be sure that I'm not warping or changing myself unnecessarily to be accepted, because that really in the last couple of 100 years has been a very strong theme in certain Jewish communities, bastardizing, warping, changing ourselves to be accepted, and it doesn't work, number one, and B, it leaves us, in my opinion, as a kind of shell of our former selves. And that's not me saying that we shouldn't grow, we shouldn't evolve. I believe that we should, but we should evolve and grow with pride. So that means quite specifically not thinking, oh, if we do this, we will be accepted. We should be thinking, oh, this is maybe a better way for us to proceed for ourselves. And I think it's about changing the focus, putting the focus back on us and not having the focus on the non-Jewish world and what they think of us. Obviously, I care what they think of us, and I care what I care how they treat us, but also I also don't care what non-Jewish people think of Jews. I don't care what the non-Jewish world thinks of Jews, apart from how it impacts us, because non-Jewish perspectives on Jewish identity, Jewish experience are kind of illegitimate unless they come from people who have done a huge amount of research. But that is, more often than not the case.
Yeah, and we live as a minority in all the societies that we live in other than in Israel.
Absolutely.
And as you know, Israel becomes then the international Jew in that regard. So how do you address in this framework that you're suggesting, because we can't ignore how the non-Jewish world thinks about us. That could be dangerous.
No, of course, yes.
So where's that bridge between Jewish pride and self-definition, and yet engagement to address anti-Jewish behavior from others?
Well, I think that Jews encouraging non-Jews to address that behavior. So again, we kind of, circling back, it has to be rooted in Jewish education. The Jews themselves need to have self-esteem. We need to know that we should be treated better than we are. We need to be able to spot the Jew hatred that we're experiencing, because that's another thing. We're not always trained to spot anti-Jewish behavior. So we need to kind of be armed with knowledge, with self-esteem, with pride before we even go to the non-Jewish world. And listen, when we speak to the non-Jewish world or non-Jewish individuals, we should be empowering, because education should always be about empowerment, but we should also have boundaries. So we're saying, this is our experience. Let us tell you. Please ask clarifying questions if you don't understand, but we're not going to accept your definitions of our experience or identity. So when we do speak to the non-Jewish world, it's to say, yes, actually, this is not okay. It's not okay that the BBC last year debated on television, should the Jews count as an ethnic minority? That's not okay, and we should have the confidence to tell them that and explain why. But that, again, it starts with us. It's us. It begins with us, and then we can take that to the non-Jewish world. And I believe to say that we should stand up for ourselves. We should fight. We should fight back to just basically reclaim our dignity because we deserve better, but also to keep this beast at bay and to encourage non-Jewish people, because there are wonderful non-Jewish allies. And it's our job to kind of help them learn and educate and empower.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about allyship, and then I want to ask you a question about the LGBTQ community as well. The allyship seems to be getting infinitely harder. Not just, who are our allies, but the Jewish community wishes to be allies for some of the other hatreds that are going on, because we know what it's meant to us. To the Black community, to the LGBTQ plus community, to the indigenous community. And when we go to approach them, we're seen as being white and the oppressor, especially vis-a-vis Israel. And so we're being excluded from those communities where we think that there's a natural allyship, but yet they're viewing us in the other camp. How do we tackle that?
It's very difficult, because hopefully we will sit down and they can respect us when we explain our experience. And again, not to harp on about it, but we have to know our experience to share with others, whoever that other may be. And hopefully they will respond and they will respect. But if they don't, that's really on them. And I believe that allyship, particularly between marginalized communities, should be a two-way street. I think it's absolutely acceptable for different communities to focus on their own experience. I'm going to be honest, I focus my attention on the Jewish experience. So I would never blame a Black person from focusing their experience on the Black experience. But if outreach is done and it actively excludes Jews, then I believe what we do is we call it out. I'm equal opportunity. I will call out Jew hatred from wherever it comes. That could be the left, the right, the Islamic world, the white world, a Black community. And I think we have to get comfortable doing that. And that is also part of the problem, that we're not necessarily comfortable, because we do live in a wider world and there are different narratives that exist about different communities and their experience, or there are different truths even. But that still does not negate our experience, and we should become comfortable calling out other communities without resorting to kind of bigoted language and without making people feel uncomfortable, but saying, actually, what you've said is anti-Jewish, or what you've said is racist, and let me explain why. And your status as a marginalized community or a minority community does not exclude you from having to take responsibility for yourself. And again, that to me comes with pride, knowing that you deserve better, knowing that you're allowed to call out another, to kind of highlight an injustice, regardless of where its source is about pride and self-esteem. We deserve better.
So in the time that's remaining, one final question, and that is, so much of the way in which you present yourself in this topic has to do with pride, not only in terms of being Jewish, but pride in terms of being a part of the LGBTQ plus community. How do you see the connections? And when you think of the word Jewish pride today, you think about pride, you think of I think anyway, the first thing that comes to my mind is the LGBTQ plus community. Why do you think that connection is so important to be proclaimed in the way in which you're proclaiming it?
Because look at the success of the LGBTQ plus community. I mean, we're not going to pretend for 1 second that LGBTQ plus phobia has been solved. It's not, and in many places it's rife and rampant. But internally, the LGBTQ plus pride movement has been extraordinarily successful. We are much more comfortable now kind of owning our identities. We are comfortable with shows like RuPaul's Drag Race being on television. That, I think, would not necessarily be the case. I mean, it wouldn't have been possible, of course, 20 plus years ago, but I also don't necessarily think LGBTQ plus people would have wanted it. Why? Yeah. Because they were uncomfortable, or we would have been uncomfortable with our difference. I think what LGBTQ plus pride can teach us is we are different, and that's okay. LGBTQ plus people are different, and Jews are different. We're not the same as everyone else, and that's fine. We can own our difference, we can celebrate our difference, and we can also understand fundamentally that the way we're being treated is unacceptable, and we're going to fight back, but we're not going to let that hate define us. We will define us. We will celebrate our own experience, our own identities. We will kind of proclaim our own leaders and celebrate our histories. And we're not going to look to the wider world for permission to do that. And we're not going to look to the wider world for cues. And I really think that's what it is. It's about empowerment. And it's about, to me, the road from LGBTQ plus pride to Jewish pride was a personal one. but like LGBTQ plus has really changed the LGBTQ plus community. That's what I hope is going to happen with Jewish Pride, that we need to have a kind of fundamental perspective shift. And I think it is happening. You know, we're seeing it all over the world. This conversation is taking place. And we have to continue fighting, and we have to continue talking, and we have to continue educating, and we have to continue creating spaces for these important conversations.
You know, I want to continue the conversation, and we can't because of time. But it seems to me that, you know, there was a moment when Israel really represented that for the Jewish people too, and I think it still does.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Having the existence of a Jewish state has an impact on Jewish pride.
Yeah.
For much of the Jewish liberal left, the Israeli politics, which have gone more right of center in the last 15 years or so, has made that more difficult. So that just like, on the one hand, Israel should be related to that Jewish pride, but on the other hand, the politics of Israel has made that more difficult for many people. So I'm going to put that aside. Maybe we can talk about that at our next. Ben M. Freeman is going to be with us again in this upcoming synagogue calendar year. So we'll have an opportunity to maybe pick up where we left off on that one. For now, I want to thank you, Ben, for being here and for at least launching this conversation in such a thoughtful way. If you want to understand more of his perspective, don't hesitate to get his book, Jewish Pride: Rebuilding a People. It is available. It's a really important book and an important conversation on this topic. Thank you, Ben, for being here. For those that are watching, be sure to join us at Bet Tzedek for the multiple opportunities to be inspired and enabled to live a meaningful Jewish life. www.beth-tzedek.org. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.